Thank you for joining us at the Lens Neighborhood Livability Association. This is, we'll couple little of announcements. Well, first of all, I'd like to remind everyone to silence your cell phones out of courtesy for everyone here and our speakers. If you don't know how to do that, maybe turn your phone off. So this Saturday is Neighbor to Neighbor. It meets here once a month, and it's a group of church people mostly, and people from the neighborhood who go out and serve mostly elderly or widowed neighbors that not all churchgoers, but just people who live in Lens. And their model is to serve the people, give some human interaction, and also help them to stay in their homes with a little yard work, home improvement type projects. And we've been partnered with them almost since our inception in 2020. And then, let's see, we have, our group does cleanups at West Rock once a week. On Saturdays in the summertime, we go from 7 to 8 o'clock, and then we find a place to go to breakfast afterwards. But that's what finances what we're able to do, because West Rock pays us to clean up the confetti that blows out of their site into the adjoining neighborhood. Then next Sunday is the VFW breakfast at the American Legion Hall. That's at 9 a.m. And many of us go to breakfast there, and they treat us like, kind of give us our own table, and we use it as a clubhouse. Wednesday, May 28th, we're going to have a coffee with a cop at, we're returning to Jenny's Sacred Grounds. They're very friendly towards law enforcement and livability issues that are kind of key to us. And we've had to search for other places over the winter just because it was, it's a small enough place that we end up meeting outdoors. It doesn't work out very well when it's raining or snowing. So anyway, without boring you anymore with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Jim Gersbach with Trees for Oregon, and you can take over.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Jim Gersbach, and you're the Lens Livability Neighborhood Association, right?
Yep.
Okay. How many folks are actually from Lens? Show of hands. Okay, so the majority. So there's also a few people from Sumner, but most of you are right here in the neighborhood that I'll be talking about. So, as it says there, Trees for Life Oregon, that's a informal group of Portland residents that got together and were concerned because we were seeing the loss of trees gradually happening over the city, and as development started to accelerate as we came out of the 2008 recession, we started to see more and more trees coming down across the city. And that perception was backed up by some statistics. Every 5 years, the city does kind of a looks at the number of trees we have in our street trees, and they have been seeing an increase because of Friends of Trees is planting a lot of trees. And so we had been gaining trees in Portland. Young trees were getting planted at a faster pace than they were coming down. Well, that has now stopped and actually gone down slightly, which mirrors a national trend. So that's the first sort of canary in the coal mine, is like we're not adding to our treescape, and part of it may be this infill redevelopment that's happening. So we became a little bit concerned about that, and sort of created a group that's trying to track issues around trees. So we created a website, treesforlifeoregon.org. You can go there, and it has everything that the city is doing around tree ordinances that are proposed. I'll talk a little bit at the end that the whole urban forest management plan is up for renewal. It hasn't been renewed in like 15 years, so it's a little bit out of date. So we'll talk a little bit about how citizens, you actually all here in this room, can influence what's going to be said about what protections we have for trees or don't have for trees under that plan. So,
and what was the website? Sorry.
treesforlifeoregon.org. So we're an ORG. We also put in a lot of research and articles from around the country, around the world, that talk about the benefits of trees or issues around trees, so that you can sort of educate yourself, inform yourself, and also there's a thing that says if you want to take action, here's how you can do it. Here's where you can write, and here's the public meetings that will be taking place about that. Because trying to break into the Portland bureaucracy can be a bit challenging, as you probably know. Okay, so let's get started. This is your neighborhood. So I did a little research here. It helps to sort of know where we're oriented, and you basically you have 205 running right smack down through the middle of your neighborhood. Oops, I don't want this to, it's on a, let's stop that. Sorry, just a second. It has a mind of its own.
I like it. I like the slideshow.
Yeah, okay. It's supposed to just manual. Okay. So I looked at some comparisons of some density. You're not the densest neighborhood. You're slightly less dense, say, than a Laurelhurst neighborhood, if you're familiar with that. Nope.
There it goes.
Okay, hang on. I'm going to have to go all the way back to the front and tell it not to do that. Oh, sorry. Okay. I think it's trying to do it as a slideshow, but
Yes.
I think we can just leave it where it's manually going forward. So anyway, your neighborhood is positioned here in Southeast Portland. It was its own town. I don't know if people knew. It was not part of Portland. It was its own separate incorporated city. But this is what it looked like when it was first, let's go forward. That's what it looked like. And one thing I want you to, this is about 1910 or so, you'll notice, let's stop it there. You'll notice that, okay, this is, hang on, I didn't go all the way back to start, so we'll start all over again. Let me get out of this. Why is it? Okay, we just have to.
Jim, you just have to speak faster.
Really, that's what it looked like. Before 205, we divided this.
Yeah, before two. Okay, we'll just start over again here, because I put it on slideshow, so we'll start over again. Okay. Sorry about that. All right, hopefully I can just manually do that, not have it keep going. So this is what it looked like.
Sorry. And then,
There we go. Okay, now if I can just pause it there. But what I want you to notice there, those large Douglas firs that you see like in Lens Park and stuff, they're not there. These are all second growth. Everything was cut down. This was agricultural land.
Still on slideshow.
Yeah, I don't know how to get it off slideshow, but I'm trying to figure out if I can pause it.
What's the date on that photo?
That was about 1910 or so. Okay, now that's gonna mess us up a little bit. I think that it's gonna keep going. All right, hold on. Let's.
Time's up.
All that technology, we understand.
yeah, we
No,
understand.
I'm trying to get it to where the screen, I can get out of it, and I'm trying to.
We're patient. Go ahead.
Okay, this is.
Hey, Nick, how are you with technology? I see. You're the youngest in the room, I swear.
I want the screen to go up, and.
Remember, this is Portland, the city that works.
Quickly on slideshows too.
Uh-huh.
Do you want me to play with it while you talk so you can just focus on John?
Yeah, and what I want to do is bring it to where it's not automatically advancing.
Let me
Okay,
play it.
if you can do that,
You,
okay.
This is more important than everybody hears from you.
Yeah, right. So, the point that you saw in that picture was that Lents did not have any trees to speak of. What was growing in those pictures were secondary growth. So there's no old growth in Lents. Today, yeah, okay, you got it now.
So does that mean everything was cleared at one point?
Pretty much, yes. People came here to homestead, to farm, carry on commerce. They didn't want trees. They wanted the land to grow stuff on. So these would have been Douglas firs that naturally reseeded, came in, that there were seeds that were in the ground, etc. People obviously then started planting trees because once you cut down all the trees, guess what it does in the summer? It's hot. So settlers had
You got
to.
it,
You
Nick.
got it.
Okay. So,
Thank you.
ask a young person. And you can kind of, I mean, Stumptown, that's where Stumptown got the name. So I guess the point being is that having trees was a deliberate choice that people made. So even though the first settlers came in and cut everything down, it didn't take too long for people to realize, like, there's a problem here. We can't really live in a city without these things. So that was one of the, in the improvement days, you wanted to get a streetcar, you wanted to get your muddy roads paved, and you wanted to put in trees so you'd have shade and some of the other benefits. So the density today, after all that tree planting over the years, now I think I have to actually tell it to.
Yeah,
do things.
definitely made it manual now.
Okay, so let's see if they can. Next, okay. In 1914, they actually laid out your Lentz Park, right? So that's the largest, 38 acres, that's the largest reservoir of trees that you have in Lentz, is today Lentz Park. And it's been 111 years, and that's still the largest park you have in Lentz, is Lentz Park. So a lot of very forward-thinking folks with trees. In their urban design, even then, they said we're going to need places to recreate, etc. But that was 114 years, and the population has doubled, and you still have the same amount of park acreage. So most of the trees in your neighborhood today are in people's yards. And one of the issues here, unlike in some of the other neighborhoods in Portland, was you have 23% tree canopy. That's in yards and everything combined, but that compares, say, to Eastmoreland, which has like 35%. So Laurelhurst. So the more affluent suburbs in the inner eastern part of Portland have a lot more tree canopy. Some of them almost double. Not quite as low. You're still a little bit higher than some of the other neighborhoods that were a little bit to the east of you. But if you look at Los Angeles has more tree cover than you do here in Lentz. 25% tree canopy in Los Angeles. New York City is almost the same as Lentz.
What does that do to, why is Eastmoreland have so much more?
Well, because when the developers laid out Eastmoreland, they wanted to sell houses to rich people, or the affluent. So they made, where do wealthy, when you can afford it, where do you want to live? You want to live with trees that are going to shade your homes. Remember, those neighborhoods were laid out before air conditioning. So they laid them out with 10-foot wide planting strips. If you've been to Eastmoreland, some of their streets have boulevards down the middle, medians. So the thinking was Ladd's Addition the same way, is build wide planting strips to put the shade trees in. If you go to older cities in the East Coast, in Atlanta, places like that, there's lots of room for big shade trees. When Lentz was developed, developers were selling a little less expensive homes, or they were individual lots that somebody subdivided and put 3 houses up or whatever. And so the thinking was just curb tight. And so that's one of the major reasons why there's not a lot of room in Lentz for those big trees like there are in Laurelhurst and Eastmoreland, because there, doesn't matter what size yard you have, there's plenty of room in the street in the planting strip. Unfortunately, I would say, and I spent quite a bit of time walking around your neighborhood, you don't have a lot of streets with those wide planting strips. It immediately puts you at a disadvantage, because where are you going to put your street trees when you've got these lots where the curb is right up to the street, the sidewalk's right up to the street, and there's the yard, and the house is like 4 or 5 feet.
Is that Steel Street?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have
It
the
looks
street
like
sign
steel
on
that
it.
goes to the bridge across.
Yeah.
There was a study that said that
Yeah.
our area was the hottest.
Yes, I'll talk about that, and you can see why. So this would be a typical street in your neighborhood, and you can see here, what I wanted to point out was, even when there isn't a yard here, a lot of times it's paved.
Yeah.
The yard has been turned into a parking lot. And I saw a lot of that. So people are preferentially designing their yards for cars. So that's impervious paved surface. You can imagine how hot this is going to be. There isn't any shade. There's a lot of paved black surface here. Now, when this is redeveloped for multifamily housing, imagine that you're going to get locked into this design because they're going to put 4-story buildings or 6-story buildings all up and down here, and there's going to be no room for a tree there. So I'm just saying, past, say you could say the economic disparities that led to having these kinds of curb-type sidewalks is going to guarantee that if nothing is done, you're going to continue to have no trees, and it's only going to be even worse because the few trees that are here in the lots are going to disappear as you build these multifamily homes or sixplexes or triplexes. And I don't know if people know, but a few years ago, the state government did away with single-family residential zoning all over the state in cities over 10,000 people. So when I was a young person, zoning was supposed to preserve neighborhood livability, right? So you couldn't live in apartment buildings. The state has sort of flipped that and said you can't have single-family zoning anymore because they want to encourage density. So that's kind of the what's coming.
Do you know what street that is?
I don't, but it is east of 82nd. 82nd's out there.
I think so.
But it's pretty representative, and that's kind of why
Yeah.
I'm showing that. Okay. Now, even when you have room that you could have put in, people are, like, here's the house. There could have been room here. People are preferentially planting dwarf things, like they're putting in mugo pines, which are going to stay 3 feet. So there's not a lot of appetite in these narrow yards for there to be a lot of trees put even if you have a single family home, there's not necessarily the appetite to put those in. And some of it is, we know that a lot of lower income people, if they're on limited incomes, they are afraid of sidewalk damage. They don't have the money to repair sidewalk repairs. Unlike Beaverton, which takes care of the street trees, for example, if anything in the right of way, they will come in every 3 to 4 years, they inspect, they take care of all that. Portland, taxpayers have said, no, we don't want it, we're not going to pay for it in our taxes. So it's up to each individual homeowner to take care of those trees, including the sidewalk damage. And so there's a lot of like, in the higher income neighborhoods, they're a little more able to pay for that. But in lower income neighborhoods, it's a real concern because sidewalk repair can be very expensive. Also paying an arborist to trim up a tree or take care of a tree or take down a tree, that's all on the homeowner. And we don't have a real system here to help our lower income neighbors deal with trees. So we all benefit from these trees, but we put all of the burden on the homeowner who has that tree. So it's one of those things where there's a common benefit. All of the neighbors around here are enjoying these people's large trees, but they're making those people be 100% responsible for it. So that's one issue that we recognize is that, is there a better way to help, for example, people on fixed incomes and senior citizens who might love the tree and wish they could keep it, but economically can't do that.
So you're here to tell us how you're going to fix that, right?
I'm just explaining what the situation is and why, yeah. We'll talk about potential solutions in a
He's just
second.
delivering bad news.
If I can get this thing to advance. No, it should just go, right?
It might work one of the arrow keys or the return key as well.
Oh, try return? Okay. Oh, there we go. Return worked. All right. Again, you can see here we're just a white picket fence and grass. And imagine you were talking about Lentz was the hottest neighborhood in Portland when Vivek Shandis from Portland State University took on, remember June, who was here in June of 21? Okay, was it a nice cold day in June? No, it was a record-breaking heat wave, 112, 115, and 116 degrees, back to back to back. Broke all records. That was an average for Portland, but in your neighborhood, in areas that were unshaded at ground level, it was like 127, I think, was the hottest he recorded, which is like it was hotter than Death Valley on that day. Life-threatening kinds of heat, because if you're out there for any length of time, you can literally die from heat stroke, heat exhaustion. It can bring on a stroke or heart attack.
I think people did die during that.
65, at least 65 people died. Some of them in their own homes.
Yeah.
So it's fatal. In fact, the one natural disaster that causes the most deaths is heat waves. It's a silent death. People sort of die quietly, you know, but you don't. It's not as dramatic as a tornado, but it actually is very, very high mortality.
I think I put those things on our page because there's a list of symptoms that you don't know you're dying of heat.
Yes,
People,
and confusion is one of the symptoms that you're not recognizing the problems. Okay, so Lentz compared. There was about 25 degrees difference in temperature between you and a neighborhood in the West Hills, which had a lot of trees. So those trees make a big difference to the temperature. On a single block, the shaded, if you have like a row of shade trees on a block, the temperature underneath those trees is 10 degrees cooler than it is when you step outside the shade to the unshaded blocks. So that's a big difference. On a 90-degree day, it's 80 degrees under the trees, and it's 90 degrees in the open space. And that can be the difference between, you know, at 80 degrees, you're probably not going to die, but at 90 degrees, you and the dog you're walking can have a lot of issues. So this is why this kind of a design is going to be problematic, because the temperature is predicted to go up. The United Nations, the Paris Accord, was supposed to keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and they're now saying we're not going to get to 1.5 Celsius because the nations are not meeting their goals on carbon emissions. So we're still, in fact, fossil fuel growth is increasing, has not gone down. In the West, it's gone down a little bit, but when you add in India and China, globally we're putting out more fossil fuels than we've ever put out before. And so the United Nations is now saying that the 1.5 was selected because the worst climate extremes were going to be mitigated if we could keep it below that. But now they're saying we've blown past that almost certainly. Within, I think, a year or two, we're going to exceed that, and it'll be potentially by the end of the century like 3 degrees Celsius more, which is higher when you convert that to Fahrenheit. So several degrees higher. And it's already, what people didn't realize is all during the 20th century when we were growing up and thinking it was nice and cool, it was already getting a degree warmer than it had been in the 19th century. So you know when your grandmother said, it used to be a lot colder when I was a kid, it's like she was right. There are pictures of the Columbia River in 1920s frozen over with Model T on it. Well, that hasn't happened in our lifetime. So that's not a very, when you look at that, I think that's an unhealthy street for the future climate that we're going to all experience. Okay, so I did the same thing there, and you said hit enter.
Yeah, return.
There we go, okay. Again, so not only do you not even grass is a little bit better because it isn't as hot, but concrete is just heats up, asphalt heats up during the day. So this is very common that people have paved over their yards. And so you don't even have, there's no possibility, even if these people move out, there's no possibility to plant something like that. Okay, so now let's move on to another thing that, those are at least the places that have sidewalks. So much of this area was, that Multnomah County didn't have rules requiring you to put in a sidewalk and a curb. So the housing was even less expensive because developers could just sell you a house and they didn't even need to bother putting in all these other amenities. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's like, well, who's going to walk? They're all going to drive everywhere, right? So we don't need curbs and sidewalks. So the result is on a lot of streets, there isn't what would be considered the right-of-way. So the property line is really that fence. This is all public right-of-way, which is actually owned by the city. That theoretically is where you could put a sidewalk and you could plant trees, but it's not defined by a curb, and so what do people do? They just park right as close to their house as they can get. And so that soil now is incredibly compacted, which makes it very unlikely that a tree would thrive in that kind of compacted soil. And this is very common in much of East Portland, which is what East Portland just complained about, is right. Like, we didn't get sidewalks, we didn't get curbs, we don't have planting strips. If I plant a tree out there, it's just going to get driven over by my neighbors next time they go to park. And you have a question?
So, do you have all the data where there's no sidewalk at all?
It is available. I don't have it tonight, but
But you have it in your database.
there is not my database. The city has gone out and they can look at the percentage, because when they did their tree inventory, they looked at what is the condition.
And do you know
Of the
who
right of way.
would have those information?
Portland Urban Forestry, in their tree inventory report, it breaks it down by improved with a sidewalk and a curb and a planting
Okay,
strip.
so what you need to do, you need to contact Councilor Rivers' office and let her know all the data, because her zip program passed yesterday.
I'm sorry, the what?
And what is the SIP program doing?
Yeah.
It's the improvement pay.
Sidewalk?
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with that, yes. So she's trying to address this problem.
Yeah, so that
Yeah.
passed yesterday.
Oh, good.
Yes,
Good, good.
so we need the data to be able to say, okay, which intersection that we need to fix.
Well, she would have access to that as a city commissioner through the urban
Well,
forestry for that.
She knows that, but if you could give her that access right away, then things could be just clicking instead of she's got to go circle for people, right? Because you already know who have it.
Well, I would direct her to the urban forestry database.
Oh, there you go, so you can contact me.
Is there somebody at the urban forest database that could assist?
Yeah, that's what, and.
If she
we're
asks,
collecting data.
All she has to do is say, would you please give me your data for sidewalk condition?
Okay, then we need
Or the
to
right-of-way
information
conditions,
then.
yeah.
Is there anybody specifically that you'd recommend?
I don't know the name of the individual who could do that. Probably Jeff Ramsey would be the name that I would suggest, because he does a lot of the science stuff there. But anyway, the problem with that is as you go to redevelop this neighborhood, you're going to potentially, if they just design the streets the way they have been designed, are you just creating the same conditions you had before? We'll talk about that in a minute. So lest it sound like you guys have had just been dumped on with poor initial development and et cetera, there have been some efforts to try and green up your neighborhood. So with 205 blasted through here, they took my grandparents' barn down in Clackamas to build 205, so I'm very familiar with that. And I know what happened, how loud and how much pollution was coming through 205 when you live right next to it, because my grandmother lived right next to it. So the folks, urban forestry and others with ODOT, et cetera, have planted trees as a buffer between all those fumes coming off of those trucks and the neighborhood. So these berms were planted with Douglas fir a few years ago, I think within the last
Was
10
that Friends
years.
for Trees that planted?
They were the contractor for it,
Okay.
but the money came through a grant.
Okay.
So it turns out that the ponderosa pines have done better, which is surprising because they're a little sensitive to air pollution, but they have survived the drought better in those conditions. But that's where those trees came from, and the purpose of that was because people who live near freeways are exposed to a lot of noise and a lot of air pollution, and that can reduce their lifespans, actually. And that's not even mentioning the stress from all that traffic. And we now know that the tires are decomposing and sending heavy metals into neighborhoods. So like Lentz School on the east side of
Right.
there is right next to the freeway. So there's been a concentrated attempt to plant trees there to protect the kids from what's spewing off of the
They don't have that
freeway.
many trees there, do they?
They didn't used to have any, and then they put some along
Oh, okay.
between them and the freeway.
They
What-
had to deal with the homeless.
What do those trees do as far as protecting the neighborhoods or schools or people or whatever?
Okay, so pollution is little particles, like soot. You can sometimes see them in the sunlight. You see these little dust things that are pollution. So a leaf, they'll get caught on the surface of the needles or the leaves, and then when it rains, they wash off and go into the ground, but they pull them out of the air essentially, because as the wind blows, it blows through the leaves. So the more leaf area you have, the more you capture. And so they cleanse the air that way. It's like they're grabbing the pollution out of the air.
Is the pollution, is it Does it kind of stay at a certain level, or does it rise?
Well, it's stirred up by the wind and stuff, but trees are, this is why the larger the tree, the better, because they can go from 60 feet down to 10 feet from the ground.
But
Most
is it
of-
acting like a barrier, kind of like a net to catch that, or does it typically go over that?
Well, where's your tailpipe? It's like 3 feet from the ground or whatever. So they're going to go from there and up. If you've ever watched somebody peel out in that cloud, and it sort of dissipates, but most of it is near ground level and maybe rising up 20, 30, 40 feet as it disperses. But it's going to be from those down there, as the wind blows, they're going to blow into here, and it's not going to capture all of it, but it's going to intercept a lot more than if there was just grass there. So that's why that's important.
Trees actually release oxygen. They take in,
Yes.
they take in dioxide.
Carbon.
In photosynthesizing, they release oxygen,
Yeah.
which is great.
And-
But their real value in situations like this was just pollution capture.
Right.
So
But I'm
that's,
just talking for the air quality.
yeah, in general, we need oxygen to
They-
breathe.
Do they thrive in that kind of environment, being by all that carbon
It's not
dioxide?
ideal for them. As I said, some trees are more sensitive to pollution than others. In Los Angeles, they were wondering in the Los Angeles National Forest in the 1950s why the pine trees, which were way away from Los Angeles, were dying. And at a certain elevation, they were all dying, and the ones above a certain elevation were fine. And it turned out the smog from LA, because they didn't have any catalytic converters, was drifting into the San Gabriel Mountains or whatever in the Los Angeles forest, or the Angeles forest, and was killing these pine trees. And because that was really heavy concentrations before they cleaned up the air down there by vehicle exhausts were just spewing out. And that was leaded gasoline and all that in those days. So that was one of the first things where they said, wow, that's killing them from quite some distance away. So you asked about, they can, and it's hot. When it's hot, air rises, and it was bringing that smog up into the mountains. That's why you get up and you look down at the city and you can see the smog layers. Okay, so there's one other positive thing. So that's positive. That's good that you're getting that there. But just recently, just this past year, 82nd, which also produces a lot of vehicle exhaust, and blows into both sides of your neighborhoods, they have planted urban forestry. Recently, used to be a state highway, the city took that over. So it's now a little bit more local control, and because of that, they have taken, in some places, urban forestry has worked with PBOT to put in planting strips within the medians to put large trees in. Now, over time, you will get larger trees, and they'll have two benefits. One, they'll capture that pollution right as it's coming out of the cars, but also they'll be shading that 4-lane
Hey, Jen,
street.
I don't see the water bags on those trees. Now, they planted trees around here with no water bags, and they all died. So are they gonna water those things?
I know that they're now planting trees for 3 years. There's a watering contract where they
Okay.
come around and water.
Okay.
So,
So we
but
had-
yes, they do need water.
We had a lady come out and talk about how hot we are out here, and it was on Duke Street, and they were gonna be putting in trees.
Yeah, we'll talk briefly about that. Okay. So
Yeah.
so you're in a hot neighborhood. You know there's been some attempts to help with plantings, but most of your trees here are not street trees. They're yard trees. Private property. Most of your trees are tied up in private property. And they're not evenly distributed. A few lots have a lot of trees, and a lot of lots have no trees. And if you walk around, it's pretty evident that plenty of home after home after home has, I will say anything that's under 15 feet does not really count as a tree. But these bigger trees that have a lot of needles, they're 100 feet tall, 90 feet tall, those are really the big impact trees. And you can see here where this one lot, when that person sells and they put a triplex or a fourplex on that lot, if nothing is done, just the normal course of development, just the normal way the free market works, is you got a narrow strip here and a narrow strip there. No trees are going to go in there, but all of these trees are going to come down, and you're going to have a 4-story or 3-story or whatever bunch of houses here, and these are all going away. And so that's going to make, not only for those people, it's going to be hotter, but for their neighbors and for the people across the street and the people who park on that street, et cetera, et cetera. So no one is saying, is that a good idea when the climate is getting warmer that we're taking away the shade? So that's one of the things we want to say is, at Trees for Life Oregon, is we need to have development, we need housing. But can we do it in a way where we're not sacrificing the livability of the neighborhoods? Is there some way we can compromise our way to where, obviously, a tree in the middle of the lot, you can't save a tree in the middle of the lot. You need to have the space for the housing. But when trees are on the perimeter, are there ways we could get creative to maybe have the housing and increase the density and still have some shade and some of the benefits? And we think that there might be a way to do that.
In Colorado, we had ordinances. I worked for a new home builder. I was a real estate agent, a broker. And if we were to go in and take over that lot, we would have been required for every tree we cut down to replace it. We could not cut down a tree without replacing it somewhere on the property.
Portland has 2 different tracks. One is if you're an existing homeowner and you're just going to stay in the home and you want to cut the tree down, then it's a little tougher if it's a big tree, like 20 inches or wider. If you're developing it for housing, then the rules change. And it's different because it's pro-development. And any lot under 5,000 feet is not required to follow those.
We couldn't sell a house unless we put a minimum of 3 trees.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's funny because in a lot of states where trees are harder to establish and it's not as easy, you get sometimes more stringent rules. But in Oregon, where we've always had trees, it seems like, why worry about one tree? Because look around. Look at Forest Park, right? And the problem is, it's like losing your hair, right? It's just a couple of strands here and there, you know.
And then you have funerals for everyone that falls out.
Right. So it's kind of like you go bald slowly, one at a time, and that's what happens to cities. And it's happening around the country. Oklahoma City had the highest rate of tree loss of any city in the country. So they were losing 0.97% every year of their trees, which means in 100 years they won't have any of their canopy.
Well, they're putting a lot of low-income housing into our areas, and I've seen so many of these skinny houses going in, fully wooded, and they tell the neighbors, we're not gonna cut down, but so many trees, and then they clear the lot.
Yeah. Well, here's some new houses. Now this is before it went into multiple family houses. These were individual homes. But you'll notice here, there was a requirement that you have to put in a tree. The developers told you got to put in a tree when you redevelop that house. So they did. So there's a red maple there. There are no overhead power lines. It's a narrow strip, but that's a reasonably medium-sized tree. But there's actually room for 2 trees, so I don't know why they got away with just putting the one in. Maybe the other one died, and it's a complaint-driven system, so if nobody called them in, there it is. But look how they've
Put rocks.
Seems like when they do an inspection, a final inspection of the property, that would be noted. But I've been seeing them cut down beautiful, like maples and firs. I mean, these are like 40, 50.
Compliance is actually a bit of an issue because they might have required it through the Bureau of Development, BDS, and when the inspector signs off and he goes, is there a tree there? And he goes, yes, and then they're done. And then 2 years later, when nobody watered it, the tree is dead, and I see that all the time, where the tree that was required to be planted is not there 3 years later, and nobody comes back and says, oh, you're out of compliance with what you're required to do. And the developer sold it, so they don't care, so it's up to the new homeowners, and they're like, well, there wasn't a tree when I moved in, or when the tree died, or whatever. So anyway, the point is that new development is supposed to trigger putting the tree in if there's room for it. But a lot of places will not have even this small of a strip. So that becomes a bit of an issue. Now, here's a case where this is Lentz Park, as you can see. That strip there is only like 3 feet wide. So when they when they redid the sidewalk there, I don't know if they connected it or it was just old and declining. They redid the sidewalk. They didn't change the planting strip width. They just continued what was already there. And 3 feet is not really wide enough to put. It's 4 feet is the preferred standard now, so that you don't get those sidewalk conflicts. So what the city did here was, well, we didn't do anything different than what was already there. And the problem is, okay, now there will never be a tree there.
There are trees there, we watched them being planted.
Well, not in this particular strip here.
This is at the bottom of the park. Right. I guess I can see it.
Do you see
I
what,
was just there this past week, so I know that. These were taken about a
do
week ago.
you see with the new form of government that some of these non-communications is gonna improve greatly to avoid, maybe?
Well, that's an interesting question. We don't know. The honest answer is we don't know because you've got different commissioners with different agendas. And some of the commissioners we have informally said it's housing, 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 first, second, and third. And they're basically saying anything that prevents us from building the maximum amount of housing is an obstacle. And so we want to get rid of it. So there's a lot of concern that a baby's going to get thrown out with the bathwater. We do have a housing crisis, and Trees for Life Oregon, I want to be very clear about this. We are not opposed to infill and housing development. We want smart housing development so that it's housing and trees. But a lot of pro-housing folks that we've talked to, and we've had a lot of conversations, are kind of like, it's such an emergency, we just don't have time to deal with good design and all that stuff. Just get people into houses, and we'll worry about climate change down the road.
Believe me, we've heard this in our
Yes.
town.
The
And
next generation will
Right.
fix it.
so the problem is, once you design it, it's there forever,
Yeah.
right? Just like you were,
It's grandfathered in.
when the people who said no one walks anymore, they're all going to drive in the future, no one walks anymore, and now we realize like it's important to have sidewalks because people need to be walking, right? Well, if you ask a developer in the 60s, they would say, walking, that was what people did in the 19th century before they had cars, right? So things change. We now realize it's good for you to have walkable sidewalks. But these, if they had moved that sidewalk 1 foot toward the park, there would have been room to put trees all up and down, and they would have shaded the street. Now, by a park, they probably, you've got these big Douglas firs, they're protected, they're in a park, not a huge issue. But imagine if this was on a residential block and they were going to put a fourplex here, and there would be no trees, and now there's no room to put them in the street. They don't require you, if you've got a substandard thing, to plan. This new sidewalk, while it's nice, will not be shaded if it's in a residential neighborhood. So what we're advocating for is to, as they are being redeveloped, to do something other than what's happened here. So this is a house, I believe, where the side yard, it appears that the side yard was sold off, just enough room to put in a house.
Like the front.
So
That's our neighborhood.
where's the room for the tree? It's got solid concrete, the whole thing.
That's
Now-
actually illegal.
Illegal?
All that concrete, they've done that
Well,
after the.
even if they had that, just the driveway in front of the garage, there's still not really much room for a tree there.
They still have room for trash, though.
Yeah, they
Well,
have
no.
room for trash. Yeah.
So the point being here is that there might well have been, the family that owned that house in the 1940s probably had trees in the side yard or whatever. Those are gone, and now you have a house, and now you have no shade, and you're not going to get any shade in the future. So you can see where what happens in the planting strip, which is the protected part, that's really where the future is going to be, is what's going to happen to your planting strips in the right of way. Because on private land, it's very difficult to see how you're going to get the housing shoved in and the trees
Hey,
saved.
Tim, you've got some questions going on here.
I know, and I want to get through the presentation. So I want to make this point. So here's another case where you have a duplex now. Well, it's two families living here, so we're getting the density, right? That's good.
One skinny.
2 houses in one. Now here, they didn't pave the whole thing, but
But they're going to.
they drive right over there. That car
They're going
is driving right over there, and no one is where. If there was a tree there, or they were supposed to put a tree there, no one's saying, "Where's your tree?" And they're using it just like an extension to their parking.
I think they got too arborvitae.
And they do have their trash.
And the broken fence.
So again, development is going to mean fewer trees, just almost inevitably, I think.
Is that in Lentz too?
All of these were taken in Lent.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, this same house, when I looked in the back, this house on the right, they had a large conifer tree in the corner of their backyard. So it doesn't take a genius. When I looked and saw to the left of that backyard, there was a multifamily house there. So these people on the right didn't sell. They're still living there in a single-family home. Their large conifer is impacted by the development on the next lot over.
Yeah.
Because with a 3-foot setback, a tree that old has probably got roots that go out into the neighboring lot, which was probably somebody's backyard. They've cut all those roots to put the foundations for the housing that's next to it.
Kill a tree.
And what happens is, it doesn't happen immediately, but over time, you lose half your roots, half the tree is going to die, and that is now a hazard tree.
Fall on a house.
Exactly. So now that tree, which these people benefited not one bit from the sale of the property next to them, but now they have to pay to remove that tree. And so, because it's going to fall on their house eventually, because it's hazardous now. And so you've not only lost a healthy tree, but even when you're not developing the lot, you can lose trees on lots that are not under development.
Maybe it will fall towards the new house.
It should only be
Unlikely.
poetic
Depends on
justice.
which side the roots are cut.
Okay, so
Yeah.
here's where we have a lot of situations where you were mentioning about Loretta Smith wants to get development. Okay, so what happens in a situation that we have here? If Loretta comes in and says, let's develop, let's get you the sidewalks that you haven't had. If we just use the designs we've always had, what do you think is going to happen on this
Cut the
street?
roots on that tree.
I mean, this is the curb-tight sidewalk. These people just, I don't know, they ran out of money or whatever, and they never got one. But if Loretta says, I'm going to give you the money to put in, city's going to pay for that.
That tree's gonna die.
What's going to happen here?
They're gonna cut the roots for that tree.
And that tree will be like the other tree. So this is a situation where maybe we want to think carefully before we just bowl through and put in a bunch of sidewalks without any thought about what impact is that going to have on the trees. So one thought is, okay, there's a parking spot there. Could they extend the sidewalk and then move it out here to give this tree room to stay? And then the sidewalk is you still got your regulation sidewalk. You might be sacrificing a parking spot, but that tree remains, because that tree could live another 50, 60 years providing shade. So that's what we're saying about design is very case specific, and if it's tree sensitive, we're all in favor of giving people sidewalks. I live in a neighborhood that has sidewalks mostly, and it's great. People walk, and they can take their kids for walks and bicycle on it. But if it's just done like the automaton, like, okay, we're automatically going to put sidewalks in and we're going to follow whatever the design was before, you need to have that flexibility to say, okay, in this situation, we have a tree, we have a neighborhood that has very few trees, we have a demonstrated disparity in temperatures. We're going to try and preserve the shade as best we can. That's what we advocate for, is can you just work around the existing trees on the corners where even if they develop that lot, you could still save this tree and still have a sixplex on that lot because it's far enough away from the center of the lot. So that's what we're saying is a little bit of adjustment and you could still have your cake and eat it too, so to speak.
But you've got to have enough advocates.
Exactly. And that's what we're all trying to make all of us advocates for good design, right? Livability is in your name. And Portland used to be the livability city, and it's surprising, but when you read about other cities around the world, Portland is really falling behind. Way behind. And I used to be very proud. I come from Portland, the city that plans.
Very much.
And you go to Chicago and you see what
And
they've
it's
done.
embarrassing.
It's like, whoa, we're kind of, other cities are creating more green spaces. New York, the High Line, they took an old railway and greened it up. So they're doing a lot, big investments with big amounts of money going
Even
in.
in Arizona, they have all kinds of requirements on trees now.
Well, because,
Even in shopping centers, you have to put, did you know that?
yes,
You have to put trees in shopping center parking lots every,
and they have had people fall on the sidewalks and suffer burns in Phoenix, Arizona. That's how
Yes.
bad the temperatures can be in the summer.
yes.
Where literally people,
That's right.
elderly person slips, falls, and by the time they can get them
My
up off the
mother.
sidewalk, they've already died.
Jim, why is Portland falling behind all these other cities?
They're falling behind because they are not thinking about increasing the canopy in a way. They're sort of relying on, we've had this canopy, it's great, all we have to do is put the trees where they're missing. So, like, we don't have to do anything other than just plant where there are spaces. But when we do the math and we look at how many empty spaces are there to plant, and you look at the number of trees theoretically, and they're doing that. You may notice if you go to other neighborhoods that have planting strips, they're putting trees into all those vacant spaces at about 2,000 a year, something like that. They're hoping to accelerate that. But even if you took all of those spaces combined, they're not going to equal the number that you're losing in the residential lots, because about 3 out of every 5 trees in the city are on private property on those residential lots for the most part. And that's where the massive losses are. If you go down Division, has anybody driven down Division recently? Notice a change?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's all of Division, all the way out is going to be like that. And all of Killingsworth is going to be all like that. So a lot of places
What
that
happened there?
they developed it. They're building the density that, because it's on transit lines.
I thought you were talking about, I think it's on Powell, those massive trees they cut down. Has anybody seen those trees?
Cutting down.
Powell?
Yeah.
I think it's Powell, like,
I think cutting down.
How they're
Massive-
putting in sidewalks and.
it's like they
Yeah.
went down and they just cut these massive.
Yeah.
Bikes and for.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It wouldn't surprise me.
I
So
don't know if it's for utility lines
They're
or.
putting in sidewalks, they're making Powell improving it.
Bike lanes,
It's so
sidewalks.
the homeless have more room.
So here's an example.
Get the new trees.
I wanted to talk about the city putting in trees. So here's an example of some forward thinking that urban forestry has looked at what trees are going to do well as the climate warms up. So this tree here is a cork oak, if you didn't know. It grows in North Africa, it grows in Spain, Portugal, where it gets very hot and very dry in the summer. Doesn't require summer watering, looks good, will survive even if we get a lot hotter. So that's a tree that will probably like it here for the rest of this
Did you
century.
say Corco?
A cork oak. That's where
Cork.
cork
Okay, good.
comes from. The bark of this tree. So it's a great tree. It's evergreen, which means it also intercepts rainfall in the winter. So it's evergreen. It stays green all year long.
I like it.
It's not deciduous.
It's not deciduous.
Not deciduous.
How big will that get, Jim?
They can get 50, 60 feet tall, so they're also a big tree. There's no ribbon wires here.
We need one.
So it's a good tree, and they have a planting strip here. So the question is, again, that's great. They have the room here to do that. And if they develop this, there will still be a big shade tree out here. But you put that through there, and how's that going to work there?
What's the lifespan of that tree?
The oldest ones in Portugal are like 250 years. They're still harvesting cork from them. So they know when they were planted and they're still getting cork off of them. So they're a very long-lived tree as well, which is typically true of.
So they slow grow or fast grow? Or?
That's pretty, I think they're pretty fast. We put some in 2011 at 42nd and Lombard, and they're probably 20 feet tall already. So not particularly slow, but they will live a long time.
Just give me a
So,
bunch of tree seeds.
You can get good trees, but the thing is, you really also, again, it comes down to the space. So sometimes you have the space, but you don't have the tree. And so this is kind of where you might want to advocate for, okay, if they're spending money to put trees in, there is an opt-out program where They will come around and say, we're planting a tree. If you don't want one, you have to opt out. Used to be you had to opt in and tell them you wanted a tree. Now they're saying, if you absolutely don't want, you have to tell us you don't want one. So hopefully in the future, spaces like this with no overhead wires will be planted with the larger trees. But this is so rare in your neighborhood that it's not really gonna help. So the next issue is this. Okay, so when you get redevelopment, does that always trigger a planting of a tree? There are regulations about how many street trees you have to put in. And you'll notice on this street, they're putting in the lampposts, and they're putting in the
Benches.
well, they're putting in all this other infrastructure, and there is a tree well there for trees down the street. So here's a bench that was put in. Somebody thought, well, people need a place to sit. So there's not a lick of shade, and this is west facing. Who is going to sit on this bench with no back, because they don't want homeless people sleeping on it? And there's like plenty of room here. You could have put a tree potentially.
Jim, that's art.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
That's our art.
How do you put a tree in when you talked about the compacted ground? Then how do you go
Oh,
about?
well, what they
putting
do,
a tree there?
they basically drive over it with a tractor trailer where they're building it, and then they'll dig the hole and they'll put a foot of soil in, and they'll call that good. So tree well soil is a whole other issue. But the point is, we know from the science that why is there concrete between those two trees? Is there any real reason why when we talk about planning, and Portland prides itself on planning, they have this idea that, well, it says tree well every so many feet, so they put in a tree well, and then they pave everything else over. What we know from studies about trees is if their roots can connect, even though they're in a narrow, if they can go laterally, the roots will grow where there's soil. And so you get a much more firmly anchored tree and a longer lived tree if this had been taken out and somebody paid for that concrete, which is also, when you make concrete, you add to carbon emissions, right? So we're doing two bad things. We're adding to carbon emissions, and we're making these trees have a much shorter lifespan. So I see this over and over and over again where sometimes you do need to have concrete around the lamppost and things like that. But there's a lot of unnecessary over-concreting that goes on in Portland that is not good for the trees. So that is an issue that I think we should all be questioning that.
Well,
Why don't we have
That's your heat
continuous?
dome right there, that was where they took the
That's-
temperature.
Yeah.
That makes it
Not
hot.
surprisingly. It doesn't surprise me at all. And who's going to sit on that bench when it's 127 degrees with no
It's
shade?
not a great neighborhood.
They'll be passed out on the bench.
Yeah, they'll
for
be
Pete's
passed
sake.
out.
So again, examples. Now, in the middle of those first two trees, there was a sign, so they had to anchor that in. But look at the next two trees beyond it. Again, unnecessary concrete. Those trees should be united with dirt in between them. Much better for those trees. Now, here they have a bioswale.
Bioswale.
But look at what else is in there.
Surrounded in concrete.
There could have been a tree there, but they're putting bike parking there. So this is one of the things is there's so many competing values. Like biking is good for you, biking is good exercise. So we need room for the bike so that they go to the city, and when the city is laying out what's going to happen in what they call the furnishing zone. They're like, well, first off, we need the security lights, so the street lights go in, the signage has to go in. Then, oh, well, the bike people are advocating that they want bike parking, so we can just get rid of it. Let's get rid of one of those tree wells and put the bike parking in there. So the bikes are there, but you lose.
Well, the bikes will make money, but the tree wells won't.
That's right.
All about the money.
So there's a case, that's exactly the problem, is trees are looked at as a cost rather than as an amenity.
Right.
So this is looked at as an amenity. Oh, bikes as an add, as a plus. The tree's just sort of there. And we call trees actually green infrastructure, because when you add up what it's costing us to build the big pipe because of all the runoff, all this impervious surface is flowing into our sewer system. And so you have to build bigger and bigger pipes to get rid of it all, so it doesn't all flow into the sewage, doesn't flow into the Columbia and the Willamette. They are actually a cheap source of reducing flood risk, and we're expecting more torrential rains over the coming decades. So the bikes aren't going to do a thing to prevent flooding or high extreme temperatures. So they're not they might help in that somebody might give up a car or whatever, but the point is are there other ways or other places to place those other than where you could put a tree? So it's not about we don't want bikes, it's just we're always putting trees kind of last in the line. And that's, I think, the issue is no one is saying trees are so important, so vital, that there really ought to be a good discussion, not just an automatic, like, well, bikes, put them where the tree was, because that's the easiest place to put them, is where the tree would have otherwise gone. And besides, you've got 3 trees on the street. How many do you need? Right?
They could take a car parking space and put that strip there this way and in one space.
That might be a solution. Let's look at some things. So here's a case of the over-concretization that we talked about. Now, this is great from an infill. People have to live somewhere. There are lots of units of housing there. So that's great. That's good. We actually support that kind of thing. And they planted trees, which is fine. But again, the mentality is one tree in a narrow hole, and then pave everything else.
And big grass.
So I didn't see anybody using this space when I was out there. And on a hot day, who's going to be out here, right? So in other places, what you want to do is you want to take and aggregate all the soil in a big island. Take the 1, 2, 3, 4 trees, put them all together in a big island with a lot of dirt. Their roots will be, and you'll have a bigger tree. Right here, they're limited because they can only put a tree in there. These trees have a shorter lifespan, some cases as little as 7 years before they fill up the roots. So we're wasting money in a sense by planting trees like that, when we could put them into bigger islands. There's plenty of room here just by pave that over and put a big planting island there. That's good design. That is thinking ahead and thinking, what's good for the trees? If you go to PCC on Portland Community College, Southeast 82nd campus, and if you go to their parking lots, has anybody been there recently? Okay. Did you notice something interesting in what they did with the trees in their parking lot?
Oh gosh.
Come on, Sid, we're depending on you.
I mean, I remember it was beautiful in the fall because you had those trees in the parking, but like in the was it alongside the sidewalk in between? Because you have the sidewalk that runs through.
Well, what they did was they put, instead of having a tree, a narrow thing, and a tree and a tree and a tree and a tree, they made a big square and they put 4 trees. And they put large trees because they have the root zones to do it. Same amount of parking that they would have had otherwise. But those large trees are going to arch out and shade far more parking spaces than the smaller tree that would have been in that narrow strip. And so you get more shade, a cooler parking lot. The trees do better, they live longer, they provide a bigger shade. So that was good, smart design in that parking lot. But that's the kind of thing we need more of, is all parking lots should be doing that. So in some cases, we're still kind of just locked into the old way. You know, when the planner, developer community was going to college, that's what they had. It's like, you need trees, great, we check that box. We got a strip of trees here and a 3-foot wide strip, so we're done. As opposed to the modern thinking, which is, well, what really makes for a successful long-term planting of trees is this bigger soil volume. So I think that's what we're trying to get at, is this can be done in a smarter way that doesn't deny you the parking spaces necessarily in a parking lot, which might be of a concern to a large business.
I think the students must have designed that then, not the city.
I'm not sure who designed it, but they were. It's definitely worth taking a look at, and it is more beautiful in the fall. And those are zelkovas, which are large trees, and nisses, which are big trees too. So this is an example of right their thinking was, heart's kind of in the right place, but their execution was poorly thought out, and they didn't look at the best designs available for this. But that's going to be that way for the next 100 years, probably. That's what happens when you don't get in at the early stages. Okay, now here we have a case where, again, that is not, there's not really room to put a tree in the street, but you do have a big, large shade tree in that lot. Now that is at the perimeter of that lot. So if that house was torn down and you put in a triplex, typically what the developer would do is just cut it down, pay the city whatever the fine is for the fee for getting rid of a tree that size, and they probably won't even have to plant one because of the density. But even if they put a little tree in the front, because they might have a little setback, it's not going to equal ever the size. So the city can use money, it's written into the rules, they can take mitigation funds from trees that are cut down, large trees, and they can actually buy easements where they could say, okay, when this is sold and the developer comes to the city and says, I'm going to put a 6-plex on here or 4-plex. So you could say, that's great, but we're going to buy an easement for this tree, for this one tree. You can build all the rest of the lot. We don't care because there's not really room to put a tree there. We'll even give you an extra story if you want. But that tree will remain there because those new residents need shade, and probably more shade because they're going to have more cars parked all along the street. So rather than, once you cut this tree down, it is probably the year 2080 before you could get something this equivalent. So when you cut a tree down, you're taking decades before you get anything like it. So in 2 generations before you have this again. And so that's the other thing, is that trees aren't like you just replace them. If somebody runs over a street lamp, you can replace it the next day. But with a tree, it's like you're looking at 2 generations to have the replacement. By which time, most of us are dead, right? So that easement is something they've been we have a very hard time finding examples where the city has gone in and said, you can have the total allowable density that you bought that land expecting to put so many units of housing on. That's fair, right? That's the market. But this is a community amenity. This benefits everyone in that neighborhood, and including the people that will be buying the units of housing. So is it worth it to be able to take a little bit of that public money to preserve that, rather than spending the money to plant trees in another part of the city which don't benefit the people that live right there? Because what's happening right now is, this is over 20 inches. They're probably paying something to cut that tree down. That money will go into a pot, and those trees will get planted at a school in another neighborhood. Okay? But it doesn't do anything for the people that live right here on the street. And it doesn't do anything for the Lentz neighborhood overall. But it's not that difficult. 10 by 10 is not that, how much does it cost to buy 10 square feet? 100 square feet of a property. So that's one example of how you can do it. Now here's an example of, these are the only 2 large trees on this block. Older homes, they're the kind of homes that could be bought as single family and turned into duplexes and triplexes, and somebody could sell them for $399,000 each. So there's money to be made in these older homes. And typically, because as you can see here, this is curb type. There's no way to put a tree in the planting strip. So why not, again, buy the frontage for these houses when they come into redevelopment and save those trees, and then let the houses go up. They're already close. You just literally tell the developer, just put the house footprint where the other one was and go up 3 stories.
Jim, what's the root width of those trees that size that say need before development?
Well, these trees were probably planted when the house was built, and so they're not going to grow into the foundation. They're growing around that, and they're not growing into the sidewalk. So because it's already had if it was in the forest and you built a house, that would have cut the roots, right? And that was the problem in the yard we saw, is that there was no house there, and so the roots were into the yard. Then they built the house on top of it and cut all the roots. In this case, that tree has probably spread its roots out this way, where the soil is, and not under the house. So that's why if you were to save that tree, you could build a new house where the old house was, and it's not going to damage the tree, if that makes sense.
You can see it when across and connected to the
Yes, this is
stone.
probably where the root is headed, because that's where the soil is. So
Right.
this little bit of sidewalk's not gonna, so the tree's probably growing its roots this way. And not, there's no
Right.
point in growing them that way.
So do most tree roots not interfere or damage the foundation?
That's a different issue. If you plant it too close and the trees are growing wide enough, yeah, they can damage foundations if they're right up against it. Now this one, that looks a little closer than it is. I think it was actually more like about 4 feet from the house.
And that's enough space for a typical tree?
It depends on the tree. In this case, I didn't see any problem with the foundation for this particular pine tree. I don't think that particularly. Now, a liquid amber might be a problem because they do have very big, thick surface roots. Something like a tree of heaven would be a problem. So it varies a little bit by species. But the point being that the house is there. You'd have to go, again, first assess the tree to know whether it's worth buying an easement or not. So we're not advocating that every tree should be purchased, but where there's a healthy tree, like this conifer could live another 100 years potentially. So that's worth saving, because if you plant a little tiny dinky tree, how long before it gets to be this size? And those shorter trees, those little trees, don't live as long as these big trees. So that's the other thing, is you already have, this tree is already providing 100% of the benefits of a mature tree, and it could do so for another 100 years. And if you plant a little one, it's only going to maybe be 20% of the benefits, and it's going to take 20 years to get big enough to provide even the 20%. Okay? So we're getting closer to the end here. And again, where there isn't room, or there's no existing trees, if these small houses were sold and the developer was going to put in like a quadruplex, the city could say, well, there's no planting strip width here. Why don't we buy 6 feet of frontage and create a planting strip for you? And then instead of having a 10-foot setback, why don't we let you have a 4-foot setback? So you get the same amount of square footage of your housing. Because that's, the housing advocates tell us, we are unwilling to give up 1 square foot of housing to save a tree. I've heard people say that. It's like, nope, if it's going to cost a unit of housing or a square foot of housing, we're not willing to sacrifice that. So they have told us, if you can come up with solutions that don't require the developers to give up any square footage, we're willing to listen to that. Now the developers are buying the whole lot, so they're going to want compensated for that footage that is in the front. So that's where the city would have to come in and say, okay, we've got this fund of money from people cutting down trees. Wouldn't it make sense to create a planting strip there, so this brand new housing that people are going to be living in, multiple families, and create a place where we could plant those cork trees and those large trees that are desirable to shade that neighborhood in the future. And that's what we kind of advocate, is why aren't we doing some proactive creation where there isn't any? And this is, I think, important for the East Portland neighborhoods like Lentz, is you kind of got shortchanged when it came to the planting strip in the original development. Just, that's the way it is, right? You didn't get the nice Eastmoreland and Laurelhurst and Alameda planting strips. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have them now with a little thought and some investment. So when Loretta Smith is talking about giving you sidewalks, is she also talking about giving you planting strips? That's the other question you should ask, is thank you for the sidewalks. Can we get some planting strips to go with them? That's what I would be asking. Yes, sir.
So I'm just thinking that rather than do an easement or purchase somebody's property, like you said, builders don't want to give up square footage or units they can build. So require trees, but don't extend these setbacks or take away what they can build under the code. So rather than spend money, just require, whatever you want to accomplish.
It should be in the
Without-
planning of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
without having to take away what the builder wants, but the city and we all get what we want is trees. don't cut down what the builder can do,
Of course,
but
that's not easy.
require certain trees that will create that canopy.
Well, part of the issue is if you have an easement, then they are required legally. They've been compensated.
Yeah, that's true.
And so they then are under obligation to make sure that in the construction, they don't damage that tree.
But we've got a city with no money.
Well, they have money for
Well,
that.
PSAP does. You talking about PSAP?
No, I'm talking about there is a tree fund for when trees are cut down,
Oh, gotcha.
and they use that to plant. There also, PSEP is a whole other kettle of fish, and they could potentially use that because it's for climate change mitigation. And what would be more mitigating of climate than what we're talking about here? But right now, there is a bunch of politicians gazing down at this little PSEP lamb in the pasture, thinking about how I can shear that lamb and bulk up some of the other bureaus that are falling short. So
How much money's in the tree fund?
it's
Money grows
over.
on trees.
At various times, it's been over $1 million, so it's not inconsiderable. And it wouldn't be possible to do it all over the city, but it's not inconsiderable. And if you're just purchasing 100 square feet here, 60 square feet there for a planting strip, there is money in select areas. And that's why we would prioritize, we would advocate that a neighborhood like Lentz, which has no other options, I mean, probably not, let's not use that money in Eastmoreland to purchase land there. They got 35% canopy. You've got 23% and likely to go down considerably. This would be a high priority area for that kind of investment. And I like your idea of using PSEP money because I think that's what it's about, climate mitigation, right? Climate change mitigation. Trees are one of the few things that has been shown to mitigate climate. One of the commissioners, though, is like they're talking about, well, no, we want to use that money to reduce carbon emissions.
But trees help with that.
Well, but the point is, that helps globally, but it's about reducing emissions, not mitigating what's happening to people living in Portland who have to deal with the climate extremes that we're going to experience. So there's a little bit of like, act globally, forget local problems.
How do we advocate then for our community to bring these two things together?
Glad you asked. And she's not a plant. So what can't, I want to just, before we get to that answer to that question, I just want to show you, this is Northwest Portland, one of the densest neighborhoods in the city. So this is not in your neighborhood. So lots of density, that's a very dense block. They took the old Victorian homes down, tore them down, single family homes, and they put massive amounts of multifamily housing. But there were 2 large maple trees here. So this is not a lot of space. I think this is like maybe 15 feet. And they preserved 2 mature trees on this corner, and they still have the high density. And these trees now, the tenants love these trees because they're about the only thing there is. But on a hot day, they come out here. If you go to this part of Northwest Portland, I used to live around the corner from there years ago. You know, people are standing under the trees on a hot day talking, and it's where their dogs stop to poop and stuff. But it's shading the building as well, so those bricks don't get baking all day long. So that small investment in that little bit of a setback has added to the value of those homes that are in those buildings and made them much more livable, much more. We know now that there's a Dutch guy named Konendijk who said, if you can look out your window and see a tree, your stress levels go down. We know that women who are pregnant who live within the same block as a large tree have lower birth weight, or less likely to have a low birth weight baby. And that research was done in Portland. And that's even adjusting for income. So you're going to have healthier weight babies. You're going to have kids that can focus. Attention deficit is reduced. There's better ability to focus when you're around green leafy structures. So everybody in that building is benefiting from the retention of those trees. And it has lots of other benefits that we could go into ad nauseum. Point being that we want the new housing, even if it's going to be dense, especially if it's this dense, those trees become even more vital. They are the green infrastructure that's going to make, if we want to still be livable at this level of density, we need to have trees in that mix. So that's what we're saying is 15 feet by 15 feet that much to ask when you do that? And some people are saying it's too much to ask. So what
Not
can
if
you
it
do?
doesn't change what the builder can do. It doesn't, I mean, those trees are an asset.
Absolutely agree. And in fact, the developer, if they're smart, would advertise you could probably sell these for more money.
Absolutely.
Because I'd rather live in that condo or
Yeah.
that apartment
Yeah.
than the one that doesn't have it. Okay, so you asked about this. So this is what we're talking about. So I've already mentioned that there's this. Not all developers. That developer that we just saw was very progressive and saved trees, but there are a lot that just want to say, you know what? Don't let any good emergency go to waste. So we have a housing crisis. Perfect. Let's get rid of every regulation we've ever felt was onerous. And so when Tina Kotek created the Housing Advisory Council, it was packed with pro-development people and very few people on the environmental side. And their recommendations were, let's build on all the farmland, let's do away with restrictions on building in floodplains.
Let's have no food, but we'll have lots
And
of
let's do away with all the
Thank
tree ordinances.
you know? Yeah.
There was a bill in the legislature that was going to prevent cities from having tree ordinances. So they go to their friends in the state and try and get state bills to prevent cities, because they know that in democracy the politicians in cities are closest to the people, and the people are going to complain, and they're going to go to their municipal people and say, I don't like how you're designing my city. So knowing that the local people are supposedly more responsive to us, go to the state and get it to where they preempt the local politicians from having any say whatsoever. That's what they did with single-family zoning. If you were to put that up to a vote of the people of Portland, it would have gone down.
Absolutely.
Right, yeah.
But we're not going to put it to a vote of the people of Portland. We're going to pass it in the state legislature, and then it doesn't matter what the people of Portland think because they don't get a vote.
And it's already been done.
It's already been done. So real quickly, the things that are happening now. So the Urban Forest Management Plan, UFMP, is being rewritten. There's been an early draft. We provided input on it, but now under the new structure, it has to go to Climate Action Committee that is made up of, I think, 4 of the 12 city commissioners. So they're going to look at it, and they're going to see what they like or don't like about it. And then it goes to the Urban Forestry Commission after the Climate Action Commission has looked at it. And then when those 2 commissions have looked at it, it'll go before the full commission. And then they'll adopt it probably later this summer or in the early fall. So I would suggest that I would go and read that Urban Forestry Management Plan as it currently exists. And if there's something you like in there, or things you see that you would like to see, start getting a hold of you're in, are you in 3 or?
We're in 1.
1, okay, east side, you're outer east, okay. So Loretta Smith and
Right.
the other 2.
Jamie Dunphy, Dundas Avalos.
Oh, okay.
And
Avalos
we
is-
need to announce this too, because they're having a town hall, the 3 of them are,
Okay,
on May 10th,
This
May
side.
10th, okay.
this Saturday.
So if any of this was like, yeah, I agree with that, I think that we want to have smart design, we want to have a livable design, we want to have housing, they need to hear from folks here because they're going to be voting on an urban forest management plan, and some of their colleagues might say, oh, well, down here in line 72, we're just going to do away with the tree ordinances. So if you don't want that to happen, you have to tell your people, I don't want that, I want this in the urban forest management plan. Because once they adopt the overall plan, Portland's urban tree ordinances will have to be rewritten to conform with the new plan. And so Title 11 is what now protects the street trees and things like that, and trees in development. So if they say, in development you can do whatever you want, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to plant trees. If you're redesigning your home, you don't have to fill in the street trees. Then that'll be what the ordinances have to conform to that if that's what it says in the urban forest management plan. So all of these, if you don't know where to find them on the, we have links, I think, to most of that. So this is what we would suggest. Telling, if you had an elevator conversation, if you happen to ride the elevator with Dunphy or Avalos or someone, is look, the current protections for large healthy trees have not been shown to be the barrier that developers would have you believe. Because we actually looked at some of the statistics, and it's something like 97% or more of all the city lots do not incur any kind of tree protection that requires any kind of payment. So that's means pretty much most of the development is not being affected by these tree ordinances to begin with. And when you look at even the ones where there was some kind of tree that was big enough to require some payment, the total cost was like 0.7% was the total added cost of that. Most of the cost increases that we're seeing that are making housing unaffordable have nothing to do with trees. They're they're cost of borrowing, so interest rates, cost of labor, minimum wage, etc. As we get rid of illegal immigrants, the roofing contractors, everybody, they're able to charge more. So there's a lot of those macroeconomic factors have a lot more to do. The price of the land is really one of the bigger factors. The trees are incidental to what it costs. That's not why your condo costs $500,000. It's because of a tree was cut down. Although they might have you believe that. So keeping the current protections has very little impact on housing affordability. And then requiring street tree planting for all of the new housing. So when you do have a new house going in, if there's room for a tree, they should require that be happening. That's the only way you're going to get those trees. And then this is where we kind of get to the Duke Street. So if you're familiar, there was Duke Street Southeast in your neighborhood where they said, well, where are we going to put the trees? There's not room really to do that. But we could create a planting strip in the middle of the block. We could take a parking space. We could dig out the asphalt and the gravel and put good dirt and soil in there, big enough, an area kind of like those big rugs there, about that size, about this parking size. And now we have a room for a tree that will grow up and shade the other parking spots and the home and the sidewalk. So that's a pilot program that they're doing to kind of see, does that work? Do the trees survive? How do people feel about them? So those bump outs, and they've done one downtown, if you know where the Regal cinemas are by the, what's that little plaza where McCormick, the fish place, was?
Oh, down by the waterfront?
No. It's in you know where Broadway is? It's one block west of Broadway.
Oh, okay.
There's a little square, a little plaza there. And there's a
Oh,
cinema.
I know that plaza, yeah.
Okay.
Director's Park?
Director's Park.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you. So if you go on the east side of Director's Park, on the sidewalk, there was just parking spaces, no trees. And it was all like high-rise and stuff. So they did a bump out there. They took a parking space and they put a couple of elm trees, I think. Or anyway, a large form tree. Because they didn't have shade there. And there's, that was the case where they were saying, well, we want to create shade for this part of the street because with all these high rises, there's a lot of reflected heat and things like that. Plus, air quality downtown is a bit of an issue because they trap pollutants and things like that.
Well, she was talking about where she's working now, the Nick Fish building, that park there, she showed it to me, absolutely no trees.
Where's that?
Nick Fish.
Building.
I don't know. Where's that?
So I'm asking you, has a constituent live in District 1? So what part of the your department, when all
I don't work for the city.
You don't work for the city?
No.
So
No.
who do you work
I'm a city resident.
for? Oh, city resident. So Dave, how come they're not talking to each other? Because you look at the Nick Fish, there's a huge park. There's no tree, and you got high density. I'll show you the picture. It's ridiculous.
Oh, I
I
wouldn't be
worked
surprised.
there, and it's like, how come there's no tree? It looked like a ballpark. I thought this is like a baseball park.
Well, Nick Fish loved youth sports, so maybe it's an honor of him.
That's huge.
Is that in Northwest Portland?
No, this is in District 1, Halsey, 105.
105th and Halsey.
Yes,
Huh.
and then they got this area where you can actually have it's like a auditorium where people could sit and then somebody in the center could sing whatever. I don't know, there's no tree. I would not want to sit there.
Yeah, who's going to sit in the summer day?
This is huge, and this is low income living. I don't get it.
And it's
Well,
it's brand new.
I know.
There was actually a proposal to exempt
There's a tree.
affordable housing from the requirement to plant a tree in front of affordable housing
That
because
is
it says,
true.
well, we want to reduce the price of housing, or we want to we want housing to be more affordable. So that would be an easy way because a tree costs $200, whatever to plant. So is the developer going to pass the $200 on and the cost to the rent? I don't know that that's really going to make a difference, but it'll definitely make a difference to those people when they run in their air conditioner every month because it's so darn hot. And then the last thing we talked about was the widening of the planting strips and encouraging those pilot programs again to do that. So I think those are all things that you can do. Now, obviously, when there's power lines, it doesn't make much sense to buy and expand it where you're only going to be able to put a short tree. But where there are no power lines, that's where you want to concentrate your efforts. Is to say that's where you should be thinking about wider designs. That's where you should put your bump outs, is there. So the last slide, oops, I got that, sorry. I got to carefully do
Jim,
this.
it'd be really helpful if you have like a list of trees that you would
trees worth planting.
that you would recommend.
Well, fortunately, that list already exists. If you go to the city and you type in Bureau of Forest, let's see, Portland Urban Forestry approved street tree list, and you find the width that you're interested in, there is a list with and without power lines. And those have all been vetted. They have. I was on one of the committees. They have arborists and nursery people, and it's generally trees that are reasonably available, that will do well in our climate, and that will grow to this right size for that strip. So in the little strips this wide, you're only going to get a tree that's going to be 25 feet tall probably. If it's wider, you're going to get a little more tree, bigger tree. If there's no overhead wires, you can get those larger trees. And they have made it a concerted effort to broaden, like in the 8-foot strips that are wide, you can get quite a variety of trees now, including the cork oak that we talked about.
Even mesquite. They are good little shade trees. They don't get huge.
Yeah, I don't know about the cold hardiness with the mesquites, but and I'm not sure about the roots with the mesquites. But anyway, there's about 25 choices on the big list.
Are the trees that are in there for the smaller, let's say, areas, are they nice canopy? Or are they just kind of straight up and not very?
So in some cases, because of the restrictions, like if you're on an arterial, the trees would just get butchered by the passing trucks, the delivery trucks and everything else. So they might have a columnar tree like a Franz Fontaine hornbeam, which is very upright. Not much shade. So it's better than nothing. If you've got 3.5 feet or 4 feet, maybe that's the only thing you can have is a what they call a columnar tree. And that's why you sometimes say, well, gee, it'd be nice to have a nice spreading tree, but it takes a while to get a spreading tree up that high to come out. And you have to carefully prune, and with the columnar, they don't have to worry about the pruning. So it's cheaper in the long run to just put a columnar tree in. That's why there's a lot of effort now in planting where there are wide strips, because that's where you get the biggest bang for the buck. They actually said if you have under 3 feet, you don't even have to plant a tree, because they're not going to do that much good, and they often break the sidewalk, so we're not even going to hassle you over a tree in that kind of a size strip. But where you have the wider strips, they would like to see trees go in there, because that's the canopy that we're losing in that 58% of the residential properties we talked about. Those are going away. And the fact that we already saw in our last census, the graph had been going like this, and then it went like this, and now it's starting to do that. So our fear is in 5 more years it'll be down even more. And that is nationwide. And that's not even counting, so that's just normal development. So what happens when a little green bug about this big that's currently in Forest Grove gets here to Portland, called the emerald ash borer?
Oh, yeah.
it's going to take out 12,000 street trees because they're ash, and that bug kills ash trees 100%. So at a certain point within the next few years, we're going to lose a lot of trees, just like they did in Detroit, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and all these places are losing their ash trees. And we have about something like 4% of our trees in Portland.
Has there been any media articles or on that bug you're talking about?
Yes, there's been several. So that's coming, and it's in Washington County. It's already now in Clackamas County and Marion County. It's in Woodburn, and they had to cut down trees in Woodburn.
Someone was on OBB talking about it last week.
June 19th, there will be, Oregon Field Guide will have a program about emerald ash borer. 15 minutes long. They went out and studied this whole thing for a year about Oregon's response. But you can watch it now on YouTube. If you do Oregon Field Guide, emerald ash borer, you can watch that video. And I work with Cassandra Perfita in my day job, helping her go around to talk to all the experts. So when you watch that video, a lot of the people that are on there, I said, you should talk to these people. But my point is, that's one pest, 12,000 fewer trees.
What stops this pest?
Nothing.
Nothing.
You can treat the tree by injecting it if you get it before it's infested. And that is pretty effective. But you have to do that every 2 or 3 years. With 12,000 trees, it's probably going to only be your highest value trees that are going to be treated. So there's no natural there is a parasitoid that they can release that lays its eggs on the larva, and then they hatch and they eat it out from the inside. It's kind of like alien. But they only reduce the populations. They don't wipe it out. So it might reduce the population by 20%, 40%. I think in the best case scenarios, the population is dropped by 80%, but they still keep spreading. So it's been in the East Coast and broke out in Detroit. It's been spreading for 25 years.
I'm from Toledo, and I've never heard of it. It's 60 miles south.
Yeah, well, actually, Toledo, you're from Toledo, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great photo of a tree that was lined with beautiful shade ash trees.
Probably out in Sylvania on the west side.
Could be. I didn't know the street. And then there's a shot 3 years later, every tree is dead. And Jeffrey Donovan from the U.S. Forest Service went and looked at the death records before and after the emerald ash borer killed the trees, because he wanted to see, does it make any difference if you lose a bunch of trees to human health? And so he carefully compared, like, okay, the same people are living in these streets before and after, right? Because people don't move that fast, right? That when you added up all the deaths that would have been expected, so let's say it was 2015 that these trees died. So in 2014, how many deaths were there in this area where the trees are dying? And then how many were there in like 2017 when they're all gone? And he found 12,000 excess deaths from just losing the trees. And it turns out that actually higher income neighborhoods had a higher amount of deaths because they started out leafier, and the change from fully beneficial, rich people live in leafy neighborhoods because it's healthier. And they lost all their trees all at once. And so their death rate from stroke and heart disease was much higher in those following years because they weren't getting the benefits. There was no interception. All the car pollution that had been getting filtered was suddenly going into their houses, and they were breathing it in, and they were dying at higher rates. Now, it doesn't mean that people were dropping dead. 30-year-olds were not dropping dead in Toledo, Ohio. But if people had, if grandpa maybe had a little bit of a heart condition, instead of dying at 80, they're dying at 75. Okay, so
breathing conditions.
Or asthma and other problems. So we know it can affect our human health. So when we're thinking about losing 12,000 trees in Portland, Jeff Donovan is saying you're losing people when you lose that many trees. So that's how stark it can be. If you want to read his research, he was just laid off by the Forest Service, as a matter of fact, as part of their cost savings. All that fraud, waste, and abuse. So he was with the Northwest Forest Research Center and did that study in Ohio. And he's also the one who did the low birth weight, comparing Portland women who were pregnant and what their birth weights were, and found that lo and behold, if you're around trees, you're less stressed, you probably go to full term.
Less depression among trees.
Probably. And it didn't even have to be right in front of your house, it could be even within the neighbor's house. So this is what Portland could look like if we go to extreme density.
The apocalypse is happening.
So this is actually in China. It's a real place, it's not an artist rendition. So, they have a housing shortage there, and they're solving
They
it.
took care of it.
They took care of it. So I think this is the answer to Portland's affordability crisis.
Right.
Well, they
I
say
love
Portland
the bridge.
population is dropping rapidly. People are tired of crime and drugs and high taxes and so on and so forth.
And they're not having babies as much as they used to.
That's right.
So, it's going to be a race between when the climate refugees from Arizona and Nevada, start arriving in mass.
Except they're getting trees. And
That's right.
my son likes
I was
it.
in Phoenix
used
2
to.
months ago, it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're
anytime outside of the
trees.
summer. Sure.
If you cut down a cactus, it's protected.
Oh, the saguaro?
20 years in jail if you get caught without permission, and you have to prove that it was diseased in order to get a
Sure.
permit to cut.
Well, because people are digging them up and selling them for thousands of dollars.
Right.
So there has to be some kind
And
of
also cutting them down to build, and they can't. The city will come out and remove it and replant it.
Sure.
But you have
So-
to pay for it.
Yeah.
Or 20 years if you just do it yourself.
Either way, you pay for it.
Either.
You're still living in a desert in Arizona.
I didn't know.
Well, that concludes this, and I know we're over time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm free to mingle. I don't want to keep people seated if you want to get up and do other things, but I'll stay around for questions. But you guys have been great. I want to thank you for your staying with all of this. And, it's a complicated issue. And like I said, it's really, democracy is about the politicians. We changed the city government so that people would listen to us. So I would just say, if you have something to say it, because they don't respond when they don't. We've heard this. Well, I'm not hearing this from my constituents because they're talking about garbage and homelessness. That's all I hear every time I go out. And I don't think that means that's all that people care about. That's just the thing that they are most concerned about, but it doesn't mean they want to throw everything else out with that. So if you care about trees, you're going to need to tell them you care about trees. I care about homelessness. When I talk to my representatives, it's always, I believe we need housing, but I want housing to be done in a way that doesn't sacrifice the livability of the neighborhoods. So I think that's kind of the message.
We love our trees. We wish we could enjoy them more like in the parks. That's why you hear about homelessness, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's impacted. I've seen trees killed because of homeless
Well, and
situation.
that's the up that, what's the name of that? Nap? They burn cars there. We just moved up here a month and a half ago.
You mean in the street,
Love
they're
our
burning
homes.
cars?
We
Yes.
live right on.
Wow.
Burn down there on the
That.
Burn 3 of them.
3 cars. I mean, and the trees are burnt around them, and there's.
And none of this happened until you moved in.
It's all your fault.
I don't think we were honest. Moved in,
Just
but
say it's-
I realized,
it's
but
not
they
causal,
told me,
it's just
oh,
coincidental.
no.
Well, that's terrible. That's terrible.
I bet I
But we
lost
love our
questions.
house and we're on that Indian Creek or whatever. But every time, I'm embarrassed for anybody to come and see us. Because they drive up and there's burnt cars and homeless people and I love
Honey,
that.
it looks good right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
It's looking real good
Really
right now.
good.
Enjoy it.
Oh, wait,
Well,
all those big.
I will say this
big,
because about the homeless situation, and I know Portland gets a kind of like, oh, it's a Portland thing. But I work for the Department of Forestry, and I go out on wildfires in the summers around the state. And I heard more about homelessness in Klamath County, remote Klamath County. I don't know if anybody knows where Bonanza,
I just
Klamath
was
County is.
reading about
1,000 population, and they have more homeless people living in the national forest there.
2,000 in one area, I just read
And
that.
it's like, you know, I'm talking to the local fire department, and they're saying like, well, you know, we've got people brewing meth in these camper vans, and you go down there because they're causing fires, and they take a rifle and shoot out your tires if you try and come down the road. So, and one of the residents said some of the more criminal elements just put a big rock in the middle of the road that was a county road. Didn't want anybody going down and seeing what they were doing.
I
And they
just read that.
complained to the county, and the county said, what do you want us to do about it?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Before, we have I live on Harney Court off 92nd, and we have a builder that came in and is going to take, it was a residential home. And because we are close to the max, they are allowing certain properties to build, this particular builder is building 8 ADUs in this property.
So an eightplex.
And he's saying this is a homeowner, but the problem that I'm having, not so much with that, which is a problem, but they have they're clearing a natural path for our deer that come down and migrate through our neighborhood. And it's just, they can't get through now, so we never see the deer anymore. We had a herd of deer that came through our neighborhood. And because the homeless have taken that over, and now the builder, I'm kind of curious why you guys and the city do not require the builders to keep certain trees. I mean, we're never going to be able to replace the wildlife trees that are in there. Never.
So the Bird Alliance of Oregon, which used to be Audubon, has definitely flagged this issue of how we're doing infill and losing these large trees because they know that's habitat. So one of the sad things is, what is it worth to you as a Portland resident to wake up in the morning and hear birds singing?
And the deer.
And to see the deer come through,
So,
the wildlife
so
is
what is,
not now.
so in this calculation of we're getting more housing, great. Hopefully if we get enough supply, the affordability supposedly is supposed to, you know, improve. That's what we're told. But if we do this in a way that's not mindful of where the habitat for birds and other things is, we end up living in a city that has no bird life.
It looks like
It looks like the last slide, right?
It does.
And that's the, how do you put a price tag on that?
Well, I had the builder come to my home with my neighbors, and we openly talked about it. I promised him we wouldn't attack him, you know. And he was really cool about it, you know. It was a nice meeting, but basically what's come out of it is that please don't say anything until I can get my permits. You know, that's basically what was said.
Yeah.
And it's just, I feel like
It's all about money. It's not
we're
about
getting
taking
jumped on
care of
in
the
an
whole-
area where they want to put all the housing, yet they're removing our canopies and they're not replacing it unless we go and beg them to do that. And it just seems like we should have some sort of requirement of these builders to retain at least 4 trees, 2 trees, some of the older trees on the property.
Well, we're sympathetic to that view. That's what we're all about, protecting those trees. But I can tell you from the state government, Tina Kotek drank the Kool-Aid about housing.
Yeah,
So
they all have.
that is the priority, right?
Yeah, and we get to drink the rest of the Kool-Aid that comes into our neighborhood.
Well, she's drinking the Kool-Aid, but where that ends up getting recycled is here.
Governor Kotek ran on a promise of 30,000 housing units each year, and that's
Yep.
what got her elected.
Yep.
Then last year, the Oregon Department of Forests, I think, closed off something like a few 100,000 acres to any further logging. So what does that do to materials cost and availability of lumber?
Who cut off?
Oregon Department of Forestry?
Well, that's what I work for, and no, that's not true. We have, there's a habitat conservation plan that says they will, in the state forest, which is 3% of Oregon's forest, they will, because there's, in some of the species, are potentially going to get listed. So to prevent more stringent federal regulations, because if it becomes an endangered species, then you are prohibited from disturbing
It
it.
was all over the news. I mean, it was close to 1 million acres or something.
Well, we only have 800,000 acres in the state forest
Okay,
combined.
a lot, then a lot. You know.
So, well, there was a lot of people in the counties that depend on timber revenue
Exactly.
who were
Small towns were suing the state
Right.
government over this.
right, and they lost those cases because what they wanted to say was, your job in the state forest is grow the tree to 40 years, cut it. Grow it to 40 years, cut it. Cut every tree at 40 years and give the money to us for our police, for our schools, etc. So if you go to Jewel, they have a beautiful new school. That's all timber money, right? And in the 1920s, what was happening was those original forests were cut down. All the old growth was cut. The timber companies bankrupted, disappeared, left the counties with a bunch of land, hundreds of thousands of acres, that they had what do we do with it? And it was growing up to weeds and creating a fire danger, and they said to the state, take this and rehabilitate it because we don't have any way to do that. And in exchange, the state said, okay, we'll do that, we'll invest and replant it, etc. And then we'll share the revenue with you. So we take out just what it costs us to manage that. But as we've gotten a better understanding of what are the values that forests have. Timber is one value, but the other value is like, where does your drinking water come from? It comes from forests. So if you're cutting them at this rotation, you're going to potentially impact the drinking supply for all these other communities. The other thing is, those are also home to different species of animals and plants and things. And if those get listed federally, then federal restrictions come in, and you're kind of handcuffed then to that, like the spotted owl and marble murrelet.
And you never heard of any land closures or any of that going on?
Well, I'm getting to what you might be referring to. So that they came up with a compromise about habitat conservation plan, which is to say, in order to preclude, if we agree to let some of the trees grow to 80 years or 120 years before they're cut, there will eventually be timber harvested on those lands. But it'll start to mimic more of the conditions of old growth, and hopefully that'll allow species that can't survive in a 40-year clear cut all the time, but there's reasonable to believe that at 100 years, the conditions are kind of what spotted owls, for example, can kind of get along in a 100-year-old forest. It's not ideal, but the trees are big enough, there's more habitat that they like, and they're prey and stuff like that. So some parts of the state forests were to be managed under a habitat conservation plan that says we're going to let some of the forest, we're not going to cut it as rapidly as we had. Where some of it we are. So some of it that's not ideal habitat, they're going to continue to cut at 40-year rotations. But they're going to let some of it get older to mimic some of what was used to be there before the original cuts. So, but what it does mean is that if 1/3 is being cut every 40 years and 1/3 is being cut at every 80 years, and say another third is being cut every 120 years, you're not going to get the same revenue that you got every year. So the argument was, we want every tree cut at 40 years. And that's all we care about, because that's how we get money at a county level. And so that was where the tussle was, between give us the money because that's how we pay for our county sheriff, or have the water supply for the surrounding towns. Now you're trucking in water, like they're doing in Klamath County a couple of years ago. They were trucking in water because their wells were going dry. So it's kind of complicated. But they did take that initially to a court in Lynn County, and then they won there because that's a timber county, and then they took it up through the appeals process, and eventually the Oregon Supreme Court said, no, the counties, that's not the only thing that those state forests should be managed for. They should be managed for all of the different uses. So,
because I've driven through northern Cal where they had the fires, and the timber companies make a big effort. They put up signs everywhere, burn such and date, reforested, whatever. I mean, the trees, I guess a lot of them aren't tall enough to see from the road yet, but the timber companies claim they've been planted.
Yeah, well, in Oregon, at least since the 70s, But there was an original law, the first law requiring replanting was in the 40s, like 1941, I think. Because of that, where timber companies were just cutting and not replanting. Some of the more responsible companies, even before the rules, were replanting. But a lot of them just cut and said, well, it's a cost to me to replant, so I'm just going to take the profits and declare bankruptcy and go somewhere else. But since the 70s in Oregon, if you're going to harvest, you must replant. Within 2 years you have to replant, and within 6 years those trees have to be.
Well, it makes sense to guarantee yourself future profit.
You would think, but small landowners who maybe only harvest once in their lifetime aren't too keen on replanting because they're not going to immediately benefit. So if you're 55 years old and you cut your trees, if you weren't required, your incentive to replant is pretty low at that point because they're not going to be harvested until you're 107 years old or whatever. So that's why Oregon still has industrial timberlands and private timberlands where there are still trees growing. Because yes, there's a lot of clear cuts, but they are required to replant. And without that replanting, sure, a warehouser might replant, but would everybody else? So,
Thank you for your presentation.
yeah, no, thanks for the great questions.
Before we wind up, would you like to introduce?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to present. For those of you that have not met yet, my name's Kelly Burris. I work with the Multnomah County DA's office. I'm one of our MAPS attorneys, so basically for each precinct, I kind of out in the community a little bit more than the rest of our DAs and work with the neighborhood response team at each precinct. So I just wanted to come out tonight to introduce myself to everybody. And
Is their budgets being cut? They're gonna lose 10 staff positions?
yeah, it is. I mean, it is budget season. The budget hearing, I think, is May 13th. And so, if you wanted to write a letter or advocating for something, that you can email board@multco.us. Is that
It's treesforlifeoregon.org.
Of course.